Chapter 2 is, again, a flyover. It is, as I said before, a survey class, so you're going to get a flyover on the early history of education in this changing world. And it could be a little complicated, but let me give you a little heads up on how I organized it here. Here's the textbook, but I want to take you back to the website on the outline, and just let me show you how this is broke down so you'll know what we're going to do. First of all, just the beginning of school, the evolution of school, and then things like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, things like that. And so I'll ask you to be able to be familiar with these terms throughout there. And one of the things I'm going to ask you too as we go through this, and I may forget to ask you, but you pronounce these out loud so that you're familiar with them. I will pronounce them in the lecture, but every time I do, I want you to say them out loud so you hear yourself say them so that you're familiar with those. Often one of the things we do when you're reading stuff is we don't pronounce them, so it's going to seem kind of funny. People around you are going to look at you, but you're going to say these out loud so you know them as we go through them. Then we get in here to the Middle Ages and the people involved with that, and then this transition to away from that into kind of the common man, the Reformation, the church role the church played, and then the coming out of that Dark Ages as we go to the common mission of people, and then perspective of education in this developing nation that goes back to the colonies, things like that will fly over. And again, more people. And throughout this chapter, it's one thing a little bit different than most, is a lot of different people involved. And I'll try and hit those. I'll pronounce them, have you pronounce them, and give you an awareness of them. Different material, different levels of school. Here's the emergence of high school, junior high, different teaching materials, things like that. And then on to working with these diverse populations like African Americans, all the people involved with that, and then it goes into like Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, education of women, and then private education, kind of just a little quick quirk on that at the end here that I'll ask you to be part of. So this is what the flyover in Chapter 2 looks like, so let's take a look. Here's the outcome. Major educational accomplishments of the Greeks and Romans, and then most important early educators in this world and what they contributed. Educational activity of the Age of Reason, which is laid out really nice here. Some of the important movements contributed to those advancements. Analyze what life was like for colonial teachers, student, parents. Articulate the historical development of education and minority groups and females. And again, that one is not, there's a very, very short piece on that. I'm surprised they haven't tried to develop that more. The problem is there's not a lot of history for the most part for quite a while now. They've been, those folks are all educated together. Historical contributions of private schools. And again, you'll see that's really short also. Analyze how understanding early U.S. educational history might be used to improve teaching today, and that's the last part. So let's jump in here. So the evolution of schooling. Here's what the beginning of that was. Written language is when schooling really took off. When even as far back as this, wasn't until they wanted to communicate in writing that they saw the need to educate people on how to do it. So this part I have highlighted down here is written language came into use. Humans felt the need to be a more formal education as societies became more complex and the body of knowledge increased. People recognized the need for schools. What they had learned constituted a subject matter, and the written language allowed them to record this knowledge and pass it from generation to generation. So that, if anybody wonders how the origin of this was, it was that need to do written things and be able to pass it on. Because prior to that, of course, it was verbal or other types of languages. Let me pop over to the notes here. Non-Western, some form of school probably existed in Sumer and China, Sisera in 2000 BC, just to give you that. But the Western education really came on a little bit later. And let's see, sufficiently generated and organized a concern for formal education as a far present day research has shown. This happened in Greece during the age of Pericles. And so I'm going to make that your first one here, number 1. Put age of Pericles, and that comes from here, period of Greek history into which sufficient great strides were made. Okay, and then what also about Western education? Formal education reached the West around 500. Greece was the first Western country with formal. Spartan education for military ambitions, that was their contribution. And Athens stressed the intellect and aesthetics. So let's look at where that came from. Here's the story about Greece. Here, Spartan was Athens, another Greek city-state which developed an educational program that heavily stressed intellectual and aesthetic objectives. And I think there's a question on the test about that, so you want to cue in on that a little bit. Between the ages of 8 and 16, some Athens boys attended a series of public schools. These boys included a kind of grammar school which taught reading and writing, so you can see some of that. And then here's the contributions of Socrates. Okay, first thing it says, Socrates left no writings, but we know how much about him from the writings of these other people. He was created the Socratic method. So let's see here. So you want to, this is number 2, and they're going to do 1, 2, 3 here, all 3 of these a little bit. So first of all, Socrates, his claim to fame was this, the Socratic method. Plato was this, he suggested society should contain 3 classes of people: artisans, soldiers, and philosophers. So that's what you're going to bring in for him. And Aristotle's thing was, he believed that the quality of society was determined by the quality of education. All right. And then all 3 believe that women and slaves should not be educated. So according to our most recent times now, we would go back and destroy all the statues and anything that was of honor or remembrance of these people, because that's what we're doing in our country right now. Any statue that represents something we don't like gets torn down. So I guess what I'm saying, if you see something from one of these folks, go ahead and feel free to just tear it down, I guess, because that's what we're doing. That's what we did to the statue of Robert E. Lee, and he had owned slaves. So these people believe that this, so they no longer should have statues either, I guess. So that's that. Let's go on to the Romanian schools here. The Roman schools conquered Greece, and Greek teachers and their educational system were quickly absorbed by the Roman Empire. Many of the educational and philosophy advances made in the Roman Empire after that time were actually inspired by the Greeks. Okay, and so they took over and they adopted their ways because they had such a good school system. So, and the first development of the first grammar school. So this will be number 3. Is what is this grammar school? And that comes back to here. Latin grammar school, early type of school that emphasized the study of Latin, literature, history, math, science, and dialectics. Okay, so that was the Roman schools, and they had that. And then Quintilian describes of educational practice and educational recommendations influenced the humanistic. And there's a question on the test about that, and you have to know that he was the first that had the humanistic move. And what is that? So number 4 here, I want to have you tell me what this is, the humanist education movement. Put a little description of what that is. So that's number 4. In this part, Romans had a genius for organization, which united the ancient world and led to the spread of education. And we're still talking a long time ago. Then we get to the Middle Ages. and Middle Ages mostly were represented by the Catholic Church, as was well on its way to becoming the greatest power in government and education in the Western world. And if you haven't heard this, this often is a little bit shocking, but the Catholic Church ran those early governments and ran those schools. In fact, the rise of the Church of Power is often cited as a main course of the Western world's plunge into the Dark Ages. As the Church stressed the importance of gaining entrance into heaven, life on earth became less important, and many people viewed earthly life as nothing more than a way to better life in their hereafter. You can see that the society in which this attitude prevailed would be less likely to make intellectual advances and stuff like that. So that was that time is based on the Catholic Church, which was the Christian Church, was an early Christian church at that time, a direct descendant of Jesus' life and death and rising from the dead. And so the church became very powerful, and mostly because of this, that we were right here, better to hereafter, better. That was all we were concerned about, is the life hereafter. So that was known as the Dark Ages. The name applies to Dark Ages to the period when, in much of the Western world, human learning and knowledge didn't just stand still, but actually regressed. And so that's what's known as the Dark Ages. Okay. Powerful and force. Church viewed earthly life as a means for a better life in the hereafter. So first of all, this will be number 5. You put a little description about Dark Ages. And number 6, about Charlemagne and the Roman role that he played in this. And one of the bright periods of education was the reign of Charlemagne. He realized the value of education as a ruler and part of education in Europe. He was in a position to establish schools and encourage scholarly activity. Came into power, education activity was extremely low. Church conducted a little educating and was carried on. So this is what you read through this and put him in here. And then, same with Alcunan's service as chief educational advisor led to common use of the several liberal arts. And they are here. There's a question on the test also about these two. So you'll want this, and this will be number 7. You'll list those 7 liberal arts and know that there's a question on the test about Alcuin, several liberal arts. Okay. In the revival learning, Thomas Aquinas changed the church's views on learning and formalized scholasticism. Let's make that number 8. What is scholasticism? Let me show you where that is. Right here. And his role. And medieval universities. That's what this reconciliation of religion and philosophy led to the growth in educational activities and institutions, establishment of the medieval university. And so you're going to tell me what that is and make yourself a little note about it. So now the transition of education, we talk about this time period. First of all, the Renaissance. Let me tell you about this first. The 2 very important movements took place in the transition period, the Renaissance and Reformation. And we're going to hit those hard here and here. And it's one of those things, when our time together is over, I would like you to have an understanding of those and what they meant, what went on at those times. Because it's the kind of thing, as a learned person from the, with a degree in education, have an understanding of what these had to do with the education today. So first of all, the Renaissance, a little description of that, and I want to see where we're at. We're number 10. And let me show you where that came from. Right here. Common people were generally oppressed. Can I highlight that word because you don't see that very often here? By wealthy landowners and royalty during the 11th and 12th centuries. In fact, the common people were thought to be unworthy of education and to exist primarily to serve land gentry and royalty. The Renaissance represented a rebellion, and they want to get that word in there in your description, on the part of common people against the suppression experienced by both the church and the wealthy. Okay, so now they kind of cross here, because when they say up here, they only say wealthy landowners, but here, now it's church and wealthy. So the church felt the same way, so that's really interesting, I think, how they, the authors here skip from here, it's just wealthy landowners, and now they're saying both were suppressing people. So you think of those two together, interesting. So that's what goes with here. This led to revival of classical learning, referred to as humanisms. Okay, and then De Feltre rekindles interest in the value of human knowledge, and Erasmus' writings provide foundation for humanist theory of education. And that's what these two are. And again, we'll revisit those in our projects, but you'll have to, there's questions about these folks on the test. So let's jump up now to what is the Reformation, and this will be number 11 here. And you write a little description of the Reformation, and let me show you where that comes from right here. And this is, again, I was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school, and if you're like me, we never studied anything about the Reformation in all the years of Catholic school. And so if you're raised Catholic and never had any learning about this, this is going to be a little hard to hear. So let me just read this to you about the Reformation. It's difficult for people today to imagine the extent to which the Roman Catholic Church dominated the lives of the common people through most of what is now Europe during the 15th and 16th century. The Church and the Pope had enormous influence over European royalty during this time. In fact, some historians suggest that the Pope and other church officials were in some ways more powerful than many individual kings and queens. After all, the Roman Catholic Church could, and frequently did, claim that unless members of royalty abided by its rules, they were destined to spend eternity in hell. So, as we talked about before, that was the main concern of that time, is you not spend eternity in hell. So, the church, the early Christian church, was really able to manipulate entire groups of people over this threat of going to hell. And it was an extremely frightening prospect by Christian people. Consequently, it's understandable the church wielded great influence. Okay, then this guy comes along, Luther, and it all comes crashing down. He rebels against the church with his 95 theses. And what did he believe? And this will be number 12. What did he believe? And let me show you where that comes from. He believed, okay, he's a Catholic priest, published his 95 Theses, and which stated that the disagreement with the Roman Catholic Church, and of these disagreements, held great implications for the importance of formal education. At the time, the church believed that it was not necessary for each people to read and interpret the Bible. Rather, the church, the church would pass on the correct interpretation of the laity. But Luther felt not only that the church had itself misrepresented the Bible. So think of this heresy at that time. He's challenging the early Christian church, and he's saying that the Catholic Church is not only misrepresenting the Bible, but also the people were intended to read and interpret the Bible themselves. So as he interpreted the Bible, he said this is meant for people to read themselves. And the Catholic Church had kept that to themselves, saying they would interpret it. And of course, what they wanted was to be able to manipulate this way and say, people, if you want to go to heaven, this is what you'll have to do. If one accepts the church's position on this matter, formal education remained relatively unimportant to the masses. If one accepted Luther's position, however, education became important to all people so that they might read and interpret the Bible themselves. In a sense, education became important as a way of obtaining salvation. These ideas of Luther eventually became all accepted and greatly influenced both religion and education for centuries to come and into today. And Luther became the Lutheran Church, and of course it's all fragmented too now. So can you now describe and distinguish the difference between the Reformation and the Renaissance? Okay. Well, let's see what Ignatius of Loyola did. He organized the Jesuit religion, which grew into a teaching order, and let's look at that. And he wanted to write this also, so you can see this was about this point, and at this time he starts the Society of Jesus, or known as the Jesuits. Jesuits worked and established schools to further the cause of the Catholic Church here. So it really was a kind of to counter these claims by Luther. That's what Ignatius did. To combat this Reformation movement, Ignatius of Loyola organized the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, and the Jesuits worked on established schools to further the cause of the Catholic Church, and they tried to stem the flow of converts to the cause of Reformation. So as you know, that was the big, when that early church broke apart, led to all these other denominations of Christian churches that exist today. And it goes back to this corruption that Luther was the first to point out. And it just really turned the whole Christian church upside down. Even though the Jesuits' main interest was religious, they soon grew into a teaching order and were very successful in training their own teachers. The rules by which the Jesuits conducted their schools were stated in the Ratio Sturdium. A revised edition still guides Jesuit schools today. Improvement of teacher training was one of the Jesuits' main early contributions. Okay, and how about Comenius here? Among the outstanding educators during the transition period, Johann Amos Comenius is perhaps best remembered for his many textbooks, including Orbis Pictus. His books were important for those that existed at the time, and they were among the first to contain illustrations. And so I have that here. First, this will be number 13. Is the first textbook with what? What did they have that were different than others? Okay, how about Mr. Locke here? John Locke, an influential English educator during the 17th century, he wrote many important education works, including some thoughts and education essay concerning human understanding. He viewed the child's mind as a blank slate, known as the tabula rasa, okay, which education could be imprinted. So that's will be your number 14 here is, what was the tabula rasa? And then we move into this era of the educational awakening. The Age of Reason. Let's go look at what that is. Okay. Awakening suggested educational progress in the world was slow and developed only a few places through the 17th. This section demonstrates current educational of that time. So what is the Age of Reason here? The beginning of the modern period of education, a period in which European thinkers emphasized the importance of reason. And that's not just too far off. So that will be number 15 right there. And then this was, this same time was the revolt of the intellectuals against ignorance and superstition, which of course they called religion. That's the reaction to the Dark Ages and the dominance by the early Christian church. Then Descartes provided a foundation for rationalism, and we'll study that later in philosophies, which posted 3 axioms, and this will be number 16, is these 3 axioms, and let me show you where they're at. Here's his 3 axioms right here. Okay, I'm going to highlight those for you, and you're going to bring those in. What about Frederick the Great? Now, what did he do? One of the influential leaders of the Age of Reason was Frederick the Great. I'd like a name like that. Too bad I mean, if you guys want to call me Fegan the Great or something, I don't know how you get that name. I guess it was a long time ago, but we just don't have cool names like that anymore. Frederick the Great. Frederick was a friend of Voltaire's and supported the notion that education was of value. He was a liberal thinker for his time and one of the few leaders who did not attempt to force the common people into a particular form of religion. And you can remember we're coming out of the religious oppression time, so that was big. So he wasn't pushing religion. Frederick also permitted an unusual amount of free speech for his era and generally allowed the common people a degree of liberty that most rulers considered dangerous at the time. In other words, the leaders at that time is do what you're told to do. Now, as a consequence, education had an opportunity to develop, not flourishing during his reign over Persia. During Frederick's reign, Persia passed laws regarding education of required teachers to obtain special training, and that was what his was. Teacher training was his thing. Okay, and morality and education, you're going to bring that in here. This will be number 17. Comes from right there. Now let's move on to the emergence of the common man. Now you got to like that thing, and I like the way that sounds because immediately I think it's me and you, regular people, because we're coming out of an era of the people that had all the say were religious leaders and government leaders and very wealthy people. And so this is the revolt against that. And the second pivotal trend of early modern period affected education was the concept called the emergence of the common man. And right here that is the period, idea that developed that common people should receive at least a basic, can I highlight that? Basic education and means of a better life. Okay, and so let's go to that. To have a better life politically, economically, socially, and educationally. All right, and then let's see who these folks were. Do I have Rousseau? Right here, works provided foundation for naturalism. And again, I got to check. This will be number 18. And that comes, what is naturalism? It comes in here. An intellectual book during the time of revolution, was a philosopher, not an educator. And I think it's a question on the test that asks what he was. But he wrote a good deal on the subject of education. His most important education was Emile. And you'll hear some stuff about that, which he states his views concerning ideal education of youth. Felt that the aim of education should be to return human beings to their natural state. Now, this is a whole nother way of thinking that hadn't been introduced before. His view on the subject is well summed up by an opening sentence in Emile, which states, everything is good as it comes from the hand and the author of nature, but everything generates in the hands of man. Okay, so that was his thing. Rousseau's educational views came to be known as naturalism. So you will bring that in there, what is naturalism, and take it from there. Now here's our debate for the day that I'm going to take in, and is abstinence only the best educational policy for schools to implement? And so I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on that, and so I'm going to come back to our thing here and drop this in here, and you'll respond to this, and I'm sure it'll be interesting. Lots and lots and lots written and put up with that. So you want to do that and then move on. And here's Mr. Pestalozzi. I kind of like that name. And Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi was a Swiss educator who put Rousseau theory into practice. Remember what Rousseau said? He was the naturalist person, and Pestalozzi put it into place. And to view Pestalozzi's schools, to study his teaching methods. Pestalozzi enumerated his educational views in a book entitled Leonard and Gertrude. Interesting. Unlike most educators of his time, Pestalozzi believed that a teacher should treat students with love and kindness. And so that will be number 19 here. Love and treat students with love and kindness. And hopefully we carry that on today. So let's look at Herbart here. Key concepts in Pestalozzi's method included expression of love, understanding, patience with children, compassion, that. So how about Herbart here? Another Johann Friedrich Herbart. Remember, this was Johann also? Must have been a popular name of the day. He studied under Pestalozzi, and maybe that's where he got his name from him too then. Influenced him, and where Pestalozzi had successfully put into practice for the developed Rousseau's educational ideas, it remained for Herbart to organize these educational events into a formal psychology of education. So Herbart stressed appreciation. Herbart training method developed into the following formal steps. And so we have those two things. And you are going to bring those 5 in here, and that it will be number 20, and they are right here. Preparation, presentation, association, generalization, appreciation. That's what goes there. And then let's start about Froebel here. What about Froebel? Friedrich Froebel was another European educator influenced by Rousseau and Pestalozzi. We just read about them, who made a significant contribution. Froebel's contributions included establishment of, okay, and this is another thing, when you leave and our time is over, you have to be able to articulate. Froebel was the father of kindergarten. He created the first kindergarten, and his emphasis was social development, concern for the cultivation of creativity and the concepts of learning by doing. He originated the idea that women are best suited to teach young children. Again, today, he would have been fired on the spot for that kind of sexism, but back in that time, he could say that because his speech was a little freer. So the father of kindergarten, and that's what I want you to put here for number 20, 21 I mean, he established the first kindergarten. He was known as the father of kindergarten. And there you go. Now, this is where I have to confess to you that I never went to kindergarten. Even though Froebel had done this many, many years ago, I went to school at a time where it was half days and we could ride the bus either to or home, but there was no ride in between. And my mother was not able to take us because of the number of babies she had at home, so I never went. And so you'll hear me whine some throughout this, but I feel like I missed out on something that I can't get back. But I never got to go to kindergarten, and I feel worse now when I see Froebel's thing, because I don't think then I wasn't able to create this cultivation of creativity and learning by doing. I missed out on that. Okay, and social development, I wonder if I missed that too. Okay, but enough about me. And then here we move on to this part about evolving perspectives on this rapidly nation. So now we come to us here. So what happened? These early settlers came, started providing most rudimentary education to their children. Remember, we go way back. Why? So they could read. And why they need to read? So they could read the Bible. And you got to remember too, this exodus from Europe, for the most part, was to escape the religious oppression. Now, I know the new history books will say economic freedoms, but mostly people were tired of the control of the early Christian church there. So almost all these Europeans that came were church people from different sectors, but they were trying to get away from the queen, who was, for the most part, connected to the church. Okay, so here they come, brought their European ideas about education, because you don't know what else to do. You're new. You're coming from this country. This is why, no matter, depending where they came from, their idea of education came with them. And soon after arrival, created educational programs throughout continental America, section will briefly examine these. So first of all, some of the East Coast were composed of groups of counties. The southern Virginia, middle were in New York. Northern counties were in New England. So first of all, the southern colonies were made up of tobacco plantations, quite obviously. Okay. Cheap labor of the slaves, indentured servants. They were wealthy landowners because they made a lot of money because their labor was so cheap. And as you know, tobacco is a highly intensive labor crop. And nowadays, of course, the federal government subsidizes tobacco, even though we have to put a warning on it. We tax the tobacco, a couple bucks a pack for when we sell it, but we also subsidize. They get money from the government when they plant the. So really interesting theory, but the whole wealth of the South was built on growing tobacco with this cheap labor. And these landowners hired tutors for children. They didn't really have schools because they had enough money. They could send for tutors from Europe to come. And then the missionaries provided some education to slaves just for Bible reading. So that was the extent of that in the southern colonies. Then the middle colonies had this diversity of inhabitants and inhibits formation of common schools. So they're from all over the place. So individual groups established their own religious schools, and they went with the apprenticeship model. Okay, let me just look what this is. Made it possible. Consequently, the respective groups established their own. Some children receive education through apprenticeship, meaning studied with somebody, learning a trade, a master already, and line of work, and so preparing them for the adult world. Some people even learned the art of teaching school by serving lengthy apprenticeships under experienced teachers. So that was the early middle counties did. And then the northern counties, a little bit different. They were settled mainly by Puritans. And you remember that from your history. Religious group from Europe. Approximately 1,000 settled near Boston. And unlike people of the southern, people in New England lived close to one another. Towns sprang up, soon became centers of political and social life. Shipping ports were established, an industry economy developed, demand numerous skilled and semi-skilled workers. So they had to do something because they needed people that knew how to do stuff. Condition eventually created the growing middle class. And I think there's a question about the middle class in the tests, and it's associated with the northern colonies. Early school laws, these conditions and common religious views. Let me see what we got over here before I jump too much farther. Yes. Northern colonies, primarily Puritan, and others, ripened rather as middle class, common schools. So what was the early school laws? And first of all is this one. The old, let me just give you this first. Views of town life. So there's a question on the test about this. Conditions of common religious views, town life, and large middle class made it possible for people to agree on public schools that led to very early educational activities in the northern colonies. So the question about that, please get that one right. This law did nothing more than encourage citizens to look after the educational needs of their children. However, 5 years later, they passed this a little more stringent, and that is enacted in Massachusetts. This is where this came from. Required towns to provide education for their youth. This law, which is often referred as the Old Deluder Satan Act, because of religious motive, stated this: the early colonial education law that required colonial towns to at least 50 households provide education for the youth. Okay, so that is here. This is number 22 here. And then Massachusetts school laws of 42 and served as models of similar in other counties. So this old Deluder Satan Act soon caught on. Laws similar to that, saying if you had over so many kids, so many families in your community, you had to provide education for them. Then this is about religion in the school. I'm going to let you do that one also at number 23. and you put something down about that. Well, let's look at these types of colonial schools. Okay. First of all, like a dame school. So I'm going to have you, if you can't find these, you look these up, but this would be number 24. What is a dame school, a writing school, church school, pauper schools? Just Google them and put a short version of what you think those or each of those are. And the dame school comes from right here, a low-level primary school in the colonial early periods, usually conducted by untrained women, hence the name dame, in her own home. That's what that was. Here's the Latin grammar school here, those types of things. So what about these early American colleges? This is really, I find this really interesting. These Harvard was the first colonial college established in 1636, and its purpose was preparing ministers. And that's one thing that just really blows my mind is all these Ivy League old colleges all have Christian beginnings. And now, of course, they've ran the other way so far that you couldn't find a cross on these campuses, if you turned over every place there was. But the origin of them all were religious. And look at this: William and Mary, Yale, Princeton, King's College, College of Philadelphia, Brown, Dartmouth, Queens College, all were religious, were Christian in its origin. Curriculum of these early colleges was traditionally a heavy emphasis on theology and classics. So it was to train ministers, people to spread the gospel so they could get into heaven. Example, the extent to which the religious motive dominated colonial colleges can be found in the 16 rules governing Harvard College, which stated, "Let every student be plainly instructed, earnestly pressed to consider well, and the main end of his life and studies to know God and Jesus Christ." So I say, what's so funny to me is now these years later that you complete extraction of Jesus from all those. I think if you were to go stand on the campus and say Jesus now, you would be arrested or persecuted in some way, but that was their origin. Okay. So, yes. First Latin grammar school establishes Boston as a college preparatory school, and then the colonial colleges like Harvard established to prepare ministers. Other early colleges followed the 17th and 18th century. Okay, and then this monitorial school established the monitorial schools. This was originated in England, represents an attempt to provide economic mass elementary education for a large number of children. So that's what that was about. And again, this is number 25, to educate large mass of elementary children. And then Horace Mann established his common elementary schools across the country, started in Massachusetts. He was the secretary of the State Board of Education, and he established the common elementary schools. And so you want to bring that in here. Number 26 is what is a common elementary school, and it's right there. Okay, and then compulsory attendance is required by law and the theory of the benefits. So here's two here. One, number 27 is what is compensatory attendance, and then number 28, what is it in South Dakota? And here's what I want you to do. If you simply Google compulsory attendance law in South Dakota, you'll be able to copy and paste the exact wording of it here. And that'll be number 28. So first of all, what is it? It comes from here, and then South Dakota is right here. And what about Henry Barnard, first Commissioner of Education? What was his contribution? Right here, you read about Henry Barnard and put that here, number 29. Okay. And this came from right here. You don't have to do with anything with this, just know this. early elementary characterized by religious as a focus of the curriculum. And again, it's so interesting how we've ran, not walked, ran away from this now. Strict discipline, ran from that. Formal and personal learning environment, poorly prepared teachers, and emphasize the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. That was what that was. Okay. And then we move on to the secondary schools as they came on the scene. First, American Academy. By the middle of the 18th century, there was need for more and better trained workers. Benjamin Franklin recognized this need, proposed a new kind of secondary school, brought about the establishment of Philadelphia of the first truly American education institution, the American Academy. Okay, that's where that came from. Established this school because he thought existing Latin grammar schools were not providing practical and secondary education that were needed. So the philosophy of curriculum and methodology of Franklin's Academy were geared towards prepare young people for employment. Okay, and so that was his thing. New type of school, the American Academy. Prepare students for employment, usually private, often co-educational, meaning girls. And then with first English educational high school here. Classical schools established U.S. and initially included a 3-year curriculum of English, math, science, and history. And then junior highs came along in the 1900s, so that was the first of that. Okay. And then let's move on to the evolution of teaching materials. The Horn Book, little thing about that. And what I'm going to have you do for each of these, instead of, you have a little thing here, but I'm going to, let's see, this will be about number 20, number 30. Number 30. You are going to insert an image into each of these. So again, how does that work? You say, for example, you Google slates. And then you go to images. And say, for example, you want this one. And you view that image. And it looks like this. You save that image. And then you should be able to insert that right into your notes. Okay, so you should bring in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different images right here. Now, if your file gets too big so you can't submit it, the D2L only takes them so, and I think it'll still accept this, then you convert it to a PDF. Maybe I better show you how that works. And this is all semester long. And if the file gets big, if you go to upload your notes into the D2L and it says it's too large, you simply convert it. And I'll show you how to convert it. And the reason you'd convert it is these files are laying on these and really swallowing these up. But a PDF takes a picture of the whole thing. And so it goes back to just a normal size, even though then your images are still there, still shows them. So So here, if I'm here and I want to insert my image, I come up here to insert, and it's a picture. I go to where I have it stored, and I bring it in here, and now it's here. And again, you'll want to resize this. You can leave it that big if you want, but I would shrink it. And now when I go to save as, I get this, and I come here and I say I want to make it a PDF, and now it's a PDF, and that way it'll shrink it down for you to submit. All right. That's what we're doing with that. And then one line, this is number 31, this is out of the textbook also. That still wants to open that PDF for me. This will be number 31. And it just has a thing about what it has to do with and that's right here, using technology to help understand history. That goes with that. All right. Let's move on. These early diverse populations, the text tries to address this. A lot about the African Americans, of course. Unfortunately, concerted efforts have been made only recently in this country to provide education to African Americans, and the following subsections briefly explore this. Well, first of all, these missionaries continue to do it, and their concern, they were missionaries, was that the slave people learned to read so they could read the Bible. Okay, so that was a big part of this. Early schools for African American children. Let me tell you a story here, and it's not very well told. When Abraham Lincoln was emancipated the slaves, large masses of these slaves decided to become free people. But what happened, nobody was ready for, like anything the government does, is these large masses of freed slaves had no place to go. They'd be just roam the country looking for work, looking for places, weren't very well accepted. Turned to some crime, settled, tried to find places to settle, but it was an unintended consequence of what do you do with all these free people now that don't have a job, don't have education, and so that's where a lot of this originated from. A lot of these folks was trying to help the country in that way. So let me read here. One of the first northern schools established for African Americans appears to have been Elijah Nua in New York City. Nua was an agent of the Society of Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts. So again, religious base, Christian base. 1807, several free Americans, including George Bell, Nicholas Franklin, Moses Liverpool, built the first schoolhouse of it for African Americans in the District of Columbia. So it kind of takes you through that. And then these contributions here of Frederick Douglass, John Chavis, Prudence Crandall, Booker Washington, what they all did. Okay. Now here's what I want you to do here, and I think I got to make sure we're at 32. These are brief, so I want you to put one more line for each of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About their, or 4, I should say, about their early contributions. Those 4. That's a bridge there. You put one more line with it and turn it red. Now these early colleges, I'm going to ask you to put something with that also. So that would be number 33 from your textbook. Then these Asian American education, Hispanic, women, and this will be number 34, I believe, is you're going to talk about the contributions of each of these. The 19th Amendment, 1920, suffrage. This is has to do with there's all those folks. Private education, known as religious affiliated schools. Private schools carried out nearly all the education in colonial times. And again, like I say, what's so interesting is how we've ran from this now, that we've all but outlawed it. I know I've talked to principals who are terrified to do anything with religious groups. So the first colonial colleges such as Harvard, William, Mary, Yale, Princeton were all private institutions. Many of the other colleges were religion affiliated private school over which most states a parent church group exists over the top of those. Okay. By churches, missionary societies, private individuals. And this right to private schools to exist came in 1816 when they thought everybody should be converted to public school. Ruled that the private school could not be forced against its will to become public. So I'm interesting that that's overturned. I predict that we'll see a lot more pressure on that. The one thing I think they'll really put pressure on is homeschooling. The feds will. The states don't mind it, but the feds aren't going to like it. So I'll see what they had. And then this role of private education. What is a parochial school? Multiple church denominations. You make a little definition of what that is. And this is number 35. What about parochial schools? There's questions on the test about that. And then this last thing here, this will be number 36. You put some information about learning from educational history right there. Okay. I told you it was a flyover. And hope you've got something that you can hang on to from here. One of the things I say, some of these people and stuff will revisit in the project where I'll assign these. But best to you with this.